Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our third part of our four-part symposium entitled Unequal Englishes, Unequal Speakers. A special welcome goes to the symposium co-conveners, Dr. Rawani Tupas, who teaches at the Department of Culture, Communication and Media, Institute of Education at University College London. He is also an associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. Next is Professor Saran Stewart, who is the Director of Academic Affairs at the Hartford campus and Director of Global Education at the NEAC School of Education at the University of Connecticut. And Dr. Mayra Garces Baxal, who serves as the Assistant Dean for Research and Graduate Studies for the College of Education at UAE University. She is also an Associate Professor in the Special Education Department. Today's session is entitled Unequal Englishes in the Classroom. I am Najla Al-Uwais, and along with my colleague, Fajr Al-Koz, we will be your hosts for this session. There will be a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session after both presentations, and so please make sure to write your questions in the chat box. We will make sure to attend to as many questions as we can within the allocated time frame. Fajr and I would also like to remind you to please follow the ethical code of conduct in this virtual space and to please keep your comments respectful. Certificates of attendance for today's session will be given based on completing the feedback forms, so please make sure to use your name as you would like for it to be printed on the certificate. Also, please feel free to reach out to us in the chat box in case of any technical issues. The organizing committee will be happy to help you with that. For our program today, we will have two presentations. Professor Ahmed Murad sends his regards and apologies as he is not able to attend today due to health issues. Now, please join me in welcoming the Dean of the College of Education at the United Arab Emirates University, Professor Hala Al-Huwairis, for her welcome remarks. The floor is yours, Professor Hala.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much again for giving me an opportunity to participate in the third session of Unequal Englishes by giving the opening remarks. Dear distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and speakers, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. I know that we have people from all over the world, so I'm very happy and delighted to be with all of you today. I followed with great interest the previous series of Unequal Englishes sessions, which were very interesting and stimulating. I believe language mediates our thinking, emotion, and imagination, and the English language represents an excellent vehicle for that. I would like to share with you my personal story in relation to Unequal Englishes. I was born in the United States. I'm not going to tell you when. And when I was 1 year old, we returned back to my home country, Sudan. And we stayed at that time just about 1 year. And then my father decided to go back again to the United States to complete his higher studies. And we went back again to New Mexico when I was, after I completed actually the first grade. And during that time, we stayed for 2 years. And I did completed my the grade 2 and grade 3 in the United States. So when I came back to Sudan, and at the time when I started, the middle school, and this is the time when Sudanese, they start, to be introduced to English language when they join the middle school. So this is the first time for students in the public schools to learn English. So for me, of course, the situation was different because I was exposed to English language earlier. So I noticed that at any English class, usually my English teachers, they always ask me to come in front of the class to read to the students the stories, or even to explain the lesson to the students. And I was always thinking about that. Why only me, right? And why they always pick up on me and they ask me to come and, in front of the class. And sometimes even they don't always ask me just to come and to speak in front of the classes, for only my classes, but also sometimes I feel like I'm also get invited to other classes where my English teachers, they are there and they are asking me again to speak in English. And I was really thinking, several times with myself, why this is the case? Is it because I'm using a different accent? Because Sudanese, again, it's a country that was colonized by Britain, and the common accent in Sudan is the British accent. Or is it because I was a little bit more advanced in English, and of course, because I was exposed earlier to English language? But anyway, I was not really sure if speaking in an American accent was of any significance or importance, but the persistence of my English teachers to talk in front of the classes gave me a strange feeling. So that's how I felt at that time. This experience taught me that standard English is defined differently by different people. And standard English is not only promoted or valued by education and books, but it also promoted and admired and actually favored also by non-native speakers of English. And I don't think that anybody can really deny that today, that English, today, if we think about, the position of English language is considered as a global lingua franca in technology, economic, trade, academia, diplomacy, and in all other spheres of global activities, which gives a certain status to English in human history. Yes, the disparity in economic, social, academic, military, and technology makes these unequal Englishes, even in English-speaking countries, a harsh reality. But I believe this is a dangerous attitude to adopt in classrooms, as students could be judged mainly by their accent or linguistic performance. Language is a complex phenomenon, and we cannot simply be categorize the language as standard or non-standard. Therefore, rather than focusing on the accent and the way words are pronounced, people should focus on the content and look beyond the stereotypes. Thank you very much for those sessions. And that really sharpened our thinking for considering different venues of thinking about the status of English language in our life. Thank you all for attending today's session, and I hope you'll find it interesting and meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hala, for your kind remarks and for sharing your personal and very relevant story with us all. It is now time for our two presentations to be moderated by Dr. Mona Al-Janahi. Dr. Mona Al-Janahi is currently serving as the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and is an Assistant Professor in Curriculum and Instruction with a concentration on language and literacy in the College of Education at United Arab Emirates University. I'll hand over to you, Dr. Mona.
Thank you very much, Najda. And thank you very much, Dr. Hala, for such an inspirational story. Hello, everybody. My name is Mona Janahi, and I'm very happy to be moderating this session today. So today marks the third of the sessions in this series, as you all know, titled Unequal Englishes, Unequal Speakers. Today's session is titled Unequal Englishes in the Classroom. And we have very distinct speakers with us today. We have Dr. Luke Liu from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. And we also have Dr. Yewande Lewis Focum from University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Let me just pull the bios of the speakers today. So the first presentation is going to be provided by Dr. Luke Liu from Singapore. Dr. Luke Liu is currently Assistant Professor of Linguistics and Multilingual Studies in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has a doctorate in Language, Discourse, and Communication from King's College London. Before academia, Dr. Luke was a secondary school teacher for 5 years. He is primarily interested in approaches to interactional sociolinguistics and ethnography, pertaining to issues such as transnational mobility, education, language rights, language planning and policy, and ethnicity. His most recent project involves examining the pedagogical value of Singlish in ELT classrooms. We also have today with us Dr. Yewande. Dr. Yewande is a lecturer at the School of Education, UWI, Mona, teaching and researching in the areas of English language and literacy with Creole speaking environments, and training teachers at various levels of the education system. She received her doctorate from the University of Iowa. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Changing English, Journal of Education and Development in the Caribbean, and the UWI Quality Education Journal. And we are going to move on. The floor is yours, Dr. Luke, with his presentation, which is titled, I Don't Speak Singlish, Linguistic, oh, just a second. Okay, so Dr. Luke's presentation is titled, I Don't Speak Singlish, Linguistic Chutzpah and Denial in the ELT Classroom. Dr. Luke, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Okay. So without further ado, I'll start with my sharing. So basically, the data and some of the findings that I'm sharing today is drawn from this piece of research that I've just conducted a couple of years ago, basically implementing a pioneering bidialectal program in a particular secondary school in Singapore. So I'll begin by talking a bit about Singlish, giving you some background about Singlish, and then we'll go straight for the data. Right. So Singlish is actually a vernacular in Singapore. That's really a mix of English and various other languages representative of the multi-ethnic population that Singapore has. And typically it's been described or characterized as a language for inter-ethnic communication, as well as being embedded in almost all aspects of life. And this is, it cuts across, not just racial groups, it cuts across aspects of social class. Usually, in any kind of casual, informal domain, people tend to resort to Singlish as a kind of communication, as a language of communication. And this is even as most people in Singapore continue to see Standard English as the preeminent form that's acceptable only in formal official domains. So what we have is, despite Singlish's sort of prevalence in informal domains of use, it's often still seen as bad English. It's also a common narrative is that it's seen as an impediment to acquiring the standard, and that particularly only the highly educated people can actually deploy and code switch between Standard English and Singlish effectively. And of course, the state also has a very negative stance towards Singlish. So officially, Singlish is seen in quite a negative light by the Singapore government. So what we have here in Singapore's English language classrooms particularly, a sort of strange phenomenon. So we have conflicting sort of ideologies. So we have student-teacher interactions, student-student interactions actually often resorting to Singlish use. Although it's often in a way that's sort of unplanned by the teacher. However, it's also something that's not officially endorsed by the Ministry of Education in Singapore. And in fact, it's been officially frowned upon. And the official sort of discourse in Singapore's education system is still that Singlish is something that's not to be allowed or permissible in the language classroom. And it's these sorts of conflicting ideologies at play that leads to certain kinds of affective, emotional kinds of stances and attitudes that Singaporeans often have. So Lionel Wee has described two sort of opposite ends of the emotional spectrum, where we have, on the one hand, linguistic chutzpah, where some Singaporeans can actually portray quite high confidence in being aware of when to use Singlish, being able to articulate the rationale for why Singlish is appropriate for particular contexts. On the other hand, we also have Singaporeans who have displayed certain kinds of anxiety towards Singlish use. So they are unsure, when is actually the right time to actually use Singlish, when is actually the right time for Standard English. So this is this polarity that is characterized by Lionel Wee as being linguistic chutzpah versus anxiety. So bear that in mind, because now we're going to look at some data. So what the study actually does is, this was, as I said, an intentional program of bidialectal education. So what I did was I tried to teach students to differentiate between features of Singlish and Standard English, and allow students to actually use both registers as a resource in the classroom. The target, of course, is still to teach Standard English, right? But allowing students to then facilitate their learning through the use of both registers. Okay, so what the study tried to do is to examine student attitudes and abilities, and our focus today will be to look at how such attitudes might fit or not with the idea or notions of linguistic chutzpah or anxiety. So this study was, as I said, conducted about 2-3 years ago. So I went to a mainstream, what we call a neighborhood secondary school. So it's not an elite school. And I taught 2 classes of 40 students each over a period of 8 weeks. So the approach underpinning this particular program was essentially to see Singlish and Standard English as both appropriate forms, but specific to particular kinds of social situations, audiences, and purposes. Singlish is allowed to be used in the classroom as a resource to facilitate the learning of Standard English. Okay, and this is in particular to affirm local identities where, you know, Singlish is a marker of Singaporean sort of local culture. So this study was done over 8 weeks, as I said, and the kind of data that we'll be focusing on are 2 sets, right? So we'll look at the focus group discussions where students would be expressing some kind of meta-linguistic, meta-pragmatic views or stances towards either or both of Standard English and Singlish. The second set of data will look at student interactions during a particular group activity when they were actually designing a poster. Okay, so the study, what I'm presenting today, the data, will look at this particular group of 3 students, so Liz, Bia, and May, and of course their interactions as well as what they, their responses during the focus group discussion. Okay, so this is the first set of data deals with them, you know, being interviewed and responding to the interview's questions. So essentially, what the kinds of stances that they expressed towards Singlish, okay, is fairly it's fairly common amongst their peers, except for Liz's response. So Liz, take note, is our sort of focal participant here when she states or makes a statement that she doesn't use English often at home or outside or anywhere. All right, and of course some of her peers actually quite surprised. So May in line 5, for example, says, "Are you serious?" Right? So in response to Liz's comment. Okay. So this is the first instance where Liz actually expresses the idea that, you know, she doesn't use English often. All right. But as they go on to explore the idea of, you know, when they actually use English or when Singlish or Standard English is actually appropriate. So their views are actually fairly prevalent as well across the student population and across the Singapore's population. Okay, so they are quite adamant that, you know, Singlish is only appropriate when you speak to other Singaporeans in informal contexts, right? So for formal situations, for example, for the oral exam and so on, only Standard English should be used. Okay, so of course they're quite aware of these kinds of, you know, appropriacy or notions of appropriacy regarding appropriateness regarding Singlish and Standard English. Okay, so crucially, what we want to draw attention here to is that the girls, or the 3 girls, were not really hesitant and uncertain. Okay, in fact, they seem to display, you know, a surety, a kind of confidence about, you know, when Singlish is actually appropriate and when Standard English is appropriate, right? So it's the sort of linguistic chutzpah that Lionel Wee was talking about. So they were not at all displaying any kind of anxiety regarding language use. So the next extract here deals with the group's interaction while they were designing a particular poster. So this was a classroom activity that I designed, and, you know, I got the girls essentially to produce a poster for advertising a certain product. So in this case, they're advertising a travel agency, right? So take note of the kind of interaction that's taking place here. Okay. I'll give you some time to read the transcript. All right, so there are certain things that, again, we should draw our attention to. So first of all, Liz insists again that she's not a fluent speaker of Singlish. So this occurs in line 10. All right, so this is a repetition of the claim that she made during the focus group discussion, that she doesn't use Singlish often. Okay. However, despite this claim that she's not a fluent speaker of Singlish, we can observe that Liz is actually the one leading the group in formulating, what sort of Singlish utterances should be deployed in the poster, right? So first of all, she appoints Beer, right, who isn't even Singaporean, okay, to be a main scribe, right, to provide and she also provides Beer with an example of what to write, okay? And then her friend May suggests a certain Mandarin feature, but this suggestion was immediately refuted by Liz. And then as Beer continues to write what Liz suggests, okay, Liz continues to propose more Singlish utterances, which is taken up by May and then authoritatively sort of endorsed by Liz herself again. So Liz, in this case, is sort of like the group leader, deciding what Singlish features to include, what features to exclude, and deciding, who to do what within the group. Okay, so this was the actual poster that they actually developed. Let's focus on two portions, the particular portion which draws our attention here. So this was the part that they were, during the group interaction, what they were actually writing down. Okay, and of course, I mean, you can see that the kinds of features which are deployed here are a mix of, in this case, in the tagline section, choice of particular Singlish features. Okay, and then in the terms and conditions portion of the poster, they only try to use standard English features. So this activity actually also portrays kind of linguistic chutzpah, right? So where this appropriate choice of Singlish in the tagline points to a sophisticated awareness of links between notions of social class and branding. So in this case, appealing to a broad general audience of Singaporeans. Okay, they also are quite aware of the purpose of communication, what the poster is for. They are aware of, depending on what feature you use, the kind of audience they are appealing to. And then, of course, they are also aware of the genres of text here, where the taglines are in Singlish, and then, for terms and conditions, some kind of standard English is more appropriate. So how then do we explain Liz's sort of chutzpah and yet concurrent denial of being, a user of Singlish? So she denies being using Singlish. So as it happens, this sort of dissonant practice has been described before, but in other sort of contexts. In this case, for example, we have Vaish and Tupas who have observed how teachers often also display what they call overlapping beliefs. Right. So teachers, for example, in Vaish's case, teachers actually believed the students' non-English home language can be useful in teaching and learning English. However, the same teachers would also hold beliefs that support English-only instruction. So a kind of monolingual attitude towards English instruction. So the kind of way in which we can try to explain these sorts of dissonant practices and overlapping beliefs is, again, to think about the conditions of unequal Englishes present in Singapore. Right? So remember that we have overarching ideologies that are conflicting regarding Singlish and standard English. Right? So Singlish is used to signal some kind of local identity, but standard English is only acceptable in formal domains. Right? So you have that. Teachers are also aware of the need to actually affirm and build rapport with students' localized identities, which is why some teachers often use Singlish to build rapport. Okay, teachers are also aware of the constraints and implications of violating state-sanctioned behavior. So if the Ministry of Education in Singapore does not permit Singlish use in the classroom, so teachers are aware that they ought not to break this kind of rule. Okay. But this is quite different in Liz's case. So in Liz's case, the case that we have before us, Singlish has already been overtly made permissible by the teacher, by the instructor. Okay, and we must understand that her claim of not using Singlish is actually contrary to her peers' claims that Singlish is a marker of in-group identity. Okay, in fact, her other friends within the group all claim to use English. Okay. Yet her supreme chutzpah must mean that her denial is not due to anxiety, right? It's not as if, Liz is being unsure of when to deploy Singlish and when Singlish is appropriate. So in order to explain this sort of dissonant behavior, okay, so one way to do it is to look at how, any kind of social actor are simultaneously embedded in multiple markets, multiple linguistic markets, right? And individuals are always faced with the need to reconcile potentially conflicting demands, okay, including demands relating to language use, which in this case, various markets may impose on them. So what are the markets, what are the linguistic markets that Liz is actually orienting to with different demands, right? So she's obviously orienting to and drawing on this dominant idea that standard English is privileged as a preeminent linguistic capital. So this is the linguistic market of the education system and of officialdom. However, she has also been socialized into Singlish use, right, through her friends, through her father. And this is, associated with the linguistic market of informal relations. So even at the time when, Liz might uphold this superior valuation of standard English, she cannot escape the inevitability of having to use and understand Singlish in order to be part of peer groups in informal social settings, like with her friends. Okay. So we come to the end of the data analysis and thinking about, what kinds of questions we can actually ask, right? So the state's positioning of standard English and Singlish has actually arguably contributed to this chutzpah and anxiety surrounding the two registers. And I presented here today a kind of third phenomenon where we have dissonant behavior of individuals claiming not to use English and yet portraying confidence about when to use the language. Okay, and when we think back to the English language classroom, and if we were to implement supposedly progressive forms of pedagogy such as bidialectal education and so on, how then do we deal with students like this who continue to uphold this superior valuation of standard English in the classroom? Okay, and in Liz's case, of course, we don't really have a case of her resisting the pedagogy in the classroom. But what if students do resist? What if family members and students don't buy into the ideology of bidialectal education? Okay, how does the teacher actually persuade them of the merits of bidialectal education? Can students actually opt out from bidialectal pedagogy? Right. So these are questions that I hope some of you in the audience can actually help to answer. Right. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Luke. This has been such an interesting talk. I have many questions for you, but we will take the questions after Dr. Uwenda's presentation. Dear audience, if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we will get back to them after Dr. Uwenda's presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Luke. Dr. Uwenda, over to you. The floor is yours.
Yes. And are you hearing me?
Yes.
Hearing and seeing. Okay, great. All right. Well, good morning, good day, good afternoon. We are in so many different time zones. My name is Yewande Lewis Folcom. And this is not the beginning of the PowerPoint. So give me a few minutes, please. All right, okay, so I'm more comfortable now. This is the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation. All right, so my name is Yewande Lewis Folcom, and I'm from the School of Education, University of the West Indies, the Mona campus, Jamaica. And the title of my presentation is Unpacking Our Own Biases issues of power in the English language classroom. So I'm going to start this presentation by referring to an article that was written by Dr. Shields Broadbent in 1997. And the title of that article is English is Requiem for English in an English-Speaking Community, the Case of Jamaica. And there are 3 points here about the title, even before we enter into the content of the article. And one is, well, we need to define the term requiem, which means an act of remembrance or repose for the dead. And Dr. Shields Broadbent is arguing in this paper that the English language is dying in Jamaica. And then she also, interestingly, identifies Jamaica as English speaking. It's part of the outer circle in Crashew's 3 circles that I'll soon show you of Englishes. And then it's interesting that the descriptor English speaking is in quotations. And I think there are 2 reasons why this might be so. One is that English is dying in Jamaica. That's her argument. And also because she knows that there's also another language in Jamaica, an English lexified Creole that we'll call Jamaican Creole. And so the theoretical framework for this presentation starts with Beverly Bryan's language as an arena metaphor. Language is simply not passing on content, but language can be seen as an arena where the arena is a space, a physical space, such as the physical space of a classroom, as well as the social and cultural spaces in which we speak. So the various speech communities filtered through race and class, right? And then the arena can be seen as a performance. In the arena, we perform. And when we speak, when we open our mouths, we are showing a particular or displaying a particular identity. We're enacting identity. And then the arena can also be seen as a place where competitions occur. So there's a contest. And certainly historically, Jamaica being a colony of England, there has been this contest between English and Creole within the linguistic space of Jamaica. And then we have Braj Catrew's World Englishes. That's another lens in this theoretical framework, where he talks about the idea that there's more than one English. There are Englishes, and that you have these different circles. So in the inner circle, you have those countries that would be, for example, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia. Those are examples of places where there are many mother tongue English speakers. And then in the outer circle are those countries who were former British colonies, like Jamaica, who, in addition to having this contested language, this colonial language, English, they have their other tongues. And then you have a third circle, an expanding circle of countries where those speakers, they have their own language. They don't necessarily have that British colonial past, but they do desire to learn English. Examples of those would be, for example, China or Japan. And then we have to pass his Unequal Englishes, where it's very helpful because what he's saying in that, in a nutshell, is that these different Englishes, Jamaican English, American English, United, UK English, they're not all equal. Jamaican English, they are different, layers. And therefore, we need to see the Englishes through different lenses, whether through the post-colonial lens or through the lens of race and social class. And so going back to Shields Broadbent's article, there are 5 points that I would like to make here. One is that she noted in that article, and certainly continuing into current time, that English monolingualism has not occurred. There was this idea that as more people became educated and embraced English, Creole would die out. That has not happened. Then in 2014, she wrote a very interesting article where she looked at the whole idea that these two languages, the former diglossia, the differences between Jamaican Creole and Jamaican English being used in different spaces, those lines have been blurred. And as a result, you have the levels of formality and informality being blurred. Then we have the contribution of Michelle Kennedy, and she says, in Jamaica, there's so much mixing of the codes that within one sentence, you can have a structure that belongs to Creole as well as a structure that belongs to English. And so you have the weaving of these languages so much so that persons sometimes are not aware of which language they are speaking. And then I would argue that English is viewed very much by students in a very instrumental way versus in an aesthetic way, as it, they are not embracing English as our language. And this is very interesting because even in the expanding circles, they view English from an instrumental way. I mean, it's the language that as was shared by the professor at the beginning, it's the language of definitely technology and other areas, and therefore you can be motivated to learn English because of its economic value. So that's an interesting juxtaposition between the instrumental versus the aesthetic appreciation of English. And then, unfortunately, the English language passes at both the elementary and the secondary school levels are still mediocre despite our outer circle status. And so this presentation really has been based on a project that I've been involved with two linguists. I'm the educator, and we had a model delivery of this PDPST project, that is the Professional Development of Primary School Teachers project in 2020. And we trained several graduate linguistics students, and they helped us to, in a semester-long course, they helped to deliver a set of workshops, 2 workshops over a period of 7 weeks to different teachers in 5 schools across 3 divisions or parishes in Jamaica. And the workshops were conducted twice a week over after school hours at the elementary level. After each session, the intention was that the teachers would implement a strategy and then return to share how effective or perhaps ineffective those strategies were, so that we could improve the strategies that we were sharing in the workshops. So one of the things about this model is that in the Professional Development of Primary School Teachers project, our focus is on language awareness, and we use Jamaican English as the mode of instruction, but encourage teachers to help students to see the differences between the 2 languages by promoting language awareness in various ways, right? Maybe in the Q&A session, I can go into the details of that. For purposes of this presentation, this research was certainly qualitative, and then I used critical discourse analysis as part of the analytical framework, and I used Patricia Smith's ABC model, that is to know thyself and to know others, meaning you write an autobiography, and in this case, a language biography. Then somebody who's different from you writes their biography, in our case, a language biography. And then there's cross-cultural communication or discussions of the differences between the different biographies. And so we collected 34 teacher language biographies where we asked them, to self-identify in terms of their language. Do you consider yourself to be bilingual? or to be monolingual in Jamaican English or monolingual in Jamaican Creole? Which one is your dominant language? What are the inputs, in terms of your own language journey? And how have these inputs impacted on your own output in terms of language, whether Jamaican Creole or Jamaican English? And then I thought, this is interesting. Let us as researchers, let's widen the scope and include ourselves in writing our own biographies and comparing it to those of the teachers. And then after we wrote our biographies as researchers, we had a focus group discussion. All right, so I'm going to move on to some of the data. So the main research question is really, what are the stereotypes and tensions in that we as teachers and teacher educators or linguists unknowingly possess and struggle through as we teach English in a post-colonial context? Because we all possess stereotypes and tensions over the two languages in our linguistic space, and how does that come across in our teaching to student teachers, and even as primary teachers, how does that come across and impact our students' learning of English? All right, so from the data, from the 36 teachers, 28 identified as bilingual, 3 as Jamaican English monolingual speakers, 3 as Jamaican Creole monolingual speakers, and 2, their responses were unclear. And for us as researchers, all 3 females, 2 identified as bilingual and 1 identified as a native speaker of a European language. And these are some of my preliminary thoughts in terms of looking at the data and analyzing it. What's very important is the growing acknowledgement that Jamaica is bilingual and not a monolingual English-speaking country, even though it never was, although persons in the past assumed such, that it was only English-speaking. But through the work of many linguists and the Jamaica Language Unit, there has been emphasis on the idea of embracing our Creole, similar to embracing Singlish, right? In terms of the teachers' own biographies, the stereotypes that were identified was that they assumed speaking English was speaking properly, talking good, as opposed to speaking Jamaican Creole was seen as broken English. You're speaking a piece of English, right? Although these references to English as proper and good were spoken by other persons in their language biographies, the colonial influence of epitomizing English is still here. And the concept of Jamaican Creole as broken English undermines the research of local linguists who identify Jamaican Creole as its own language separate and apart from English. From our own biographies, here are some of the stereotypes. The idea that there's only one correct way of speaking, or that some accents are better than others within the Englishes. And you have a quote there. I won't read the quote. You can read it as I'm speaking. And the thought that came to mind is that monolingualism is part of the colonial artillery or weaponry, and it still impedes that push towards bilingualism that our researchers have been trying hard to help our citizens see, and that the Englishes are indeed not all equal. Another stereotype is English is seen for many students as foreign, as not our own. And in this example, you have this quotation from the focus group now. Children, when you ask them to speak in English, they tend to speak it with a twang. And what does twanging mean? So twanging means, thanks for the time, twanging means to speak English with a certain accent. So instead of speaking it with a Jamaican accent, they think that in order to speak English, all I have to do is just layer on an American accent, even on top of the Creole, and I'll be speaking English. Of course, that is not the case. And so even though Jamaica has had 367 years of English, we have this ambivalent and sometimes hostile relationship to the language, which impacts how students view English and therefore how they learn English. And we know from second language acquisition theories that if students have a negative attitude towards a language, it can impede their learning of that language. Speaking comfortably as a luxury that is not available to speakers of Jamaican Creole. And that luxury is available to speakers who speak Jamaican English. And it's so interesting in Dr. Lu's presentation in the beginning when he said that, you know, that persons of a certain social class have that ability to speak the Singlish and the English at high levels of competence and speak comfortably, I'm sure. And so here we have monolingual, and I'm asking the question, is monolingual English hegemony a relic of our colonialism, our colonial past? And then you have here the outer circle meeting the inner circle English. And this indeed is my experience of, as a Jamaican English speaker, going to do my graduate studies in the United States, both for my master's and for my PhD. And in two incidents, I learned that as a woman, I needed to hold my tongue, speak more softly, and ask questions rather than making direct statements. Otherwise, I was often perceived as being abrupt. And so for me, it's not just about the accent or about the vocabulary that we use that can create miscommunication, but is it also, are the Englishes also about ways of being and doing that are tied up with the language? So is it really inequity or just cultural difference? And that's a question that I'm throwing out to the audience. I think this is the final data set, but the competence with academic literacies despite English language instruction. Our students are being instructed in English language from the elementary level, from kindergarten level, all the way up to tertiary. And yet the students are insecure about their own English language competence in terms of academic literacy. And I think for me, the pivotal question is, how do we as educators support teachers to teach English language to largely Jamaican Creole speaking children so that their English language competencies in academic literacies are of a high standard? So why does this all matter? It matters because stereotypes and struggles influence how teachers teach a language. Our belief systems as teachers impact our pedagogical choices. What do we choose to teach and how we behave, our attitudes towards our students? Do we shut them up because they speak a certain way, because they sound a certain way? And therefore, language is about identity work and not simply passing on information. And certainly, the socio-historical power contest between the two languages in Jamaica, Jamaican Creole on the one hand and Jamaican English on the other hand, does not serve the needs of our students. And therefore, what are the pedagogical implications? I suggest it's about repositioning the language identity of the teachers. One of the things for us as teacher educators is to help students understand that even if they're not native speakers of English, they can be teachers of English. They just need to do the professional work, right? To acquire that content, they need to do the identity work, right? And so it's okay, it's not problematic. Persons in the expanding circle who teach English do it all the time. And therefore in Jamaica, once we recognize ourselves as bilinguals, we too can realize it's okay that I'm not a native speaker, I can teach English and teach it well. We need to value both languages. And we do that in the professional development of primary school teachers project through the first 1 or 2 sessions where we do a lot of work on the sociolinguistic component of language, looking at the negative attitudes, the stereotypes, and that is through towards the two languages. And that is why we have teachers writing their language biographies, reflecting on it and discussing it. And then we have to own English as our own. It's been here for 367 years, right? And certainly in one of the other projects that I've been involved with, we taught the poem. It's an oral poetry recitation competition. And we have two anthologies, a British anthology, and we also have a Caribbean anthology. And in that Caribbean anthology, we have poets who have written poems in both Caribbean English as well as Caribbean Creole, or closer home Jamaican English as well as Jamaican Creole. And Jamaica is part of the Caribbean. And then adopting Beverly Brand's Teaching English in a Creole Speaking Environment, her 5 principles, and specifically the principle of input, having targeted and intentional input of the English language versus immersion, since there are fewer models of English language speakers, native speakers in Jamaica. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yuande. That was such a lovely discussion of, Jamaican English and Jamaican Creole, and particularly in the classroom, because oftentimes we do research or we do read about these in research, but when it comes to pedagogical implications, we stop and we stand still. We're like, what do we do as English teachers? So we will now be taking questions from the audiences. So if they could please include their questions either in the chat or the Q&A. Thank you for joining us as well, Dr. Luke. So my first question, and this is also something that the audience have asked as well in the Q&A tab, is in both presentations, Dr. Luke's and Dr. Yuande's, there are instances of resistance, maybe not so much in Dr. Luke's presentation, but just seeing, vernacular English or different forms of register as bad English or broken English. How do we deal with these, for example, students or with these teachers who think so? Dr. Yuande, do you want to?
So, okay, I'll start. That's a very interesting question. And I think it goes back to a question that Dr. Lu asked about, do the students opt out? Well, the same thing can be asked of the teachers. Do the teachers opt out? So my response to that is, one, we need to do that sociolinguistic work with the teachers to help them to see that you can value both languages. And certainly in our project, what's very interesting, we started it in, I think, 2015, and we actually had a teacher who walked out on our first workshop session.
Wow.
Because she's saying, it's pointless. Why are we teaching Jamaican Creole? And she misunderstood the focus of our workshop. We were not teaching the students Jamaican Creole. We were teaching them English, but we're using Jamaican Creole as a resource. And we're also valuing the mother tongue, the heart language of the students. So we want our students to be bilingual, to be competent, to feel proud about their heart language, and to be competent in this language that carries so much weight globally, So part of it is mistrust, So it takes patience on our part as educators, as linguists, to gain the trust of parents and teachers. But I think we should also have that option for them to opt out. I mean, we didn't have a choice. I mean, she walked out and never came back. But guess what? The other 36 remain. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Lu.
Thank you, Dr. Wande.
Right. I mean, in Singapore's context, I mean, I talked about the state having a particularly antagonistic view towards English. Right, the state always positions English as an impediment to learning the standard, and it was really a minor miracle that I got to do this piece of research in the secondary school, only because of my own personal connections with the principal. Right, otherwise it would never have been approved if I went through the state. Right, so that's the reality in Singapore. The second point is, I guess, as Yuanda has actually mentioned, there is a case for us to actually persuade and convince the stakeholders that there is value to these forms of pedagogy, right? Using the vernacular as a sort of resource to teaching the target, which is still the standard kind of English that we want the students to learn, right? And we can do that only through research, right? By showing them that students can actually do better in the classroom if we value their localized identities, if we value the kind of linguistic resources that they bring to the classroom, and so on. And lots of research has actually been done around the world that demonstrates this. Although in Singapore we have not done that as much because of this negative anti-English sentiment of the state, right? But there is this, if we have this window of opportunity, I think the only way forward is really to show them the research, right? That's the empirical evidence that we have. I mean, but convincing students is a different matter altogether. I mean, I was a secondary school teacher myself. It's difficult to deal with students within the classroom as it is without having to convince them of the value of your pedagogy and of your own teaching practice, right? So that's something that I've yet to grapple with. It's probably something that I have to deal with as I try to scale up, the program across multiple schools. I mean, that's the eventual goal anyway. In Singapore, to scale up this. I mean, I've only taught this to two classes, right? So let's scale it up to multiple schools and see what happens. But in order to do that, then I would have to deal with students who potentially might resist these sorts of ideas. And then what do we do, right? So I'm hoping that some people within the audience might have experience doing this. I mean, how do they, as teachers, how do they handle situations like that? Yeah.
Dr. Luke, you did talk about, these opposing instances of chutzpah and anxiety. So in your area of research, have you seen examples of anxiety rather than chutzpah?
Oh, anxiety happens especially when people have to deal with officialdom, right? So they're often unsure, am I allowed to use English when communicating with official channels and so on and so forth, right? So the example that Lionel Weave gives is of a person within the transport ministry, asking him how to pronounce a particular name of a train station, right? Do we pronounce it in a Singlish way or do we pronounce it in some kind of received pronunciation way, right? So I mean, Lionel himself, he refused to provide him with the correct pronunciation, but he cited the case in his work as an example of anxiety, right? So this person is unsure, right, of whether either kind of pronunciation might be seen as appropriate or or it might offend somebody higher up in the hierarchy, in the bureaucracy or something. And it actually happens quite often, right? So on TV channels in the media, for example, people often, broadcasters often have to grapple with the idea of whether Singlish is permissible on official broadcast media. Although I would have to say that in the last 10 years or so, on radio particularly, radio DJs have been more acceptable of Singlish use. So they have been, Singlish has been slipping into their interactions. And to be fair, the government has not clamped down yet, right? Whereas in the past, 20 years ago, they would have easily, just, fined the radio station, right? But in the last 10 years, the response has been very mellowed. Yeah. So we have seen some kind of change in a positive direction in this sense.
So, and sometimes I do understand where teachers also come from, especially teachers who do have resistance. Like sometimes they would be like, you're doing a disservice to the students, the high stake examinations or university or job opportunities are all based on standard English with correct pronunciation. So how do we strike and this is a question for both of you, how do we strike a balance between providing spaces for students to include these forms of English, but also at the same time maintaining perhaps that level of standard English for job opportunities, for graduation and whatnot?
In our project, there is a particular strategy that we use because called RAFT, Role, Audience, Form, and Topic. It's not unique to us, and I think Beverly Brand in her book, she had an example of it. But you can create scenarios, role playing that kind of comes from that communicative language teaching approach, where you can have activities where you say, okay, which language would you choose to speak in this scenario? Or maybe you can say, okay, I want you to use X language in a particular scenario. So in one of my graduate classes, I actually had the students summarize the theories of Lev Vygotsky and Jean Piaget in Creole using a TikTok video. And then I had another set doing the same activity, Lev Vygotsky and Jean Piaget as and in that TikTok video they used Jamaican Creole, and in the public debate they used Jamaican English. So you can create scenarios. You can have, for example, I tell my students, you want to go to the United States and you're in front of the immigration officer, which language do you think you're going to speak, right?
Right.
And practicing that. So I think it's for us as teachers to create these scenarios where they think about which language would be, optimal, and to practice both.
Dr. Iwande, in your presentation, you talked about, helping students have confidence in their level of competency in English. This came to mind because yesterday my students had a cultural exchange opportunity with Japan, with students from Japan. And, both of them are English speakers of English, second language speakers of English, our students being Arab and Emirati and their students being Japanese. And constantly, I noticed that many of the Japanese students would first apologize for their broken English, and then they would start, their communication. So do you think this goes back to the schooling? Does this go back to the way in which they were taught? So why is there this level of anxiety, as Dr. Luke describes it, towards our abilities or students' abilities in English competencies?
I think I'll let Dr. Luke take that one. And then...
Sure.
I mean, I can't say for sure, but I mean, for the Japanese students, it could partly be the cultural, socialization that they've been through as well. So, the kind of politeness that they portray. So that's one aspect to consider as well. But certainly in Singapore's context, I can only speak for Singapore's context anyway. Students generally are quite okay. So it's for practical reasons in testing scores, international PISA tests and whatnot. Singaporean students on average do pretty well in English proficiency tests, right?
Yes.
In fact, we outscore so-called native speaker countries like the US and the UK regularly, right? However, when it comes to acknowledging whether English is part of that Singaporean identity and acknowledging whether who owns English and notions of ownership and things like that, Singaporean students tend not to portray as much confidence, right? And it's partly to do with this idea of, I believe it's partly to do with this idea that has been drummed into them, that has been quite prevalent around the world as well, of this idea of native speakerhood, right? So the idea that native speakers have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, from particular nations, and so on and so forth. So even as the younger generation, in fact, the official stats show that about 80% of home languages in home language, right? 80% of Singaporeans' home language nowadays is actually English, right? So most Singaporeans actually grow up speaking English. English is the official language, that's the official medium of instruction in all schools, right? Yet, we cannot claim ownership over the language, and we are, and we exhibit some kind of anxiety regarding our own proficiencies, even as we do better in international tests than than other countries. So it's this strange situation. It's ideological, right? It's a self-imposed kind of anxiety, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luke.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Lu that it could be the example that you gave could be, again, the politeness culture of Japan to, apologize and then speak. Each culture has its own form, of politeness constructs. And then I think I agree, he said it, there are these hierarchies going back to the different circles. And so if I'm not in that inner circle, I can never reach that standard and that struggle to, okay, can we embrace this as our own language in Jamaica? 367 years, yeah, but we still struggle with that Creole English identity. So maybe it's that ideology of, because I'm not in that particular circle, or sometimes social class, my English won't be ever that good. But also we have to go back to the pedagogy, certainly in Jamaica, and look at how English is taught, because certainly on our end there can be a lot of improvement.
Sorry, just to add on, just a quick remark. So some of these ideologies are actually institutionalized as well. So for example, in Singapore schools, obviously Singlish is not permitted in the classroom officially within the syllabus, but also we have unequal treatment of speakers of English, right? So for example, Singaporeans, students who apply to universities in the US and UK would still have to, prove their proficiency in English, despite English being a medium of instruction in all schools, despite most Singaporeans growing up speaking English as a first language, they would have to take TOEFL and IELTS and stuff like that. Whereas this requirement is immediately waived for any student from your home countries, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Ireland, and so on and so forth, right? So obviously there is this unequal treatment of people from certain nations, regardless of whether English is a first language for those people or not.
That's a very interesting point. Absolutely. Dr. Yuwande, you have a question from Angela, and Angela asks, why is JC, Jamaican Creole, is growing compared to monolingual English as predicted by the researcher you mentioned?
That is an excellent question. And I'm sure that there are many factors that have contributed to that. Shields Broadbaugh, her explanation of it is that instead of persons abandoning their mother tongue as they are more educated and they're growing in their level of English, the English itself is changing. It's the whole, linguistic contact. So when you have two languages coming together, there are changes in the inner forms of a language. And in this case, what is happening is people are, deciding not to abandon their mother tongue because they still use it in informal settings at home, right? So that's not changing. And then instead of she calls them their adoptive users of English. So yeah, they're not. Then there's also Lawrence Carrington also has shown that through the arts, Jamaican Creole has a certain cultural agency through, for example, the music of Bob Marley, the Wailers, poetry, different authors, you know, who have gained international an international reputation. And as they're writing about Jamaican culture, they're not only writing in Jamaican English, they're bringing the language of the characters in the story. And so I think because of that cultural agency, people unknowingly are bringing their own language, and it's thriving. So I think those are my, you know, my response to it. But I think a linguist, I'm not a linguist, I'm an educator, could perhaps give some other response. But that's my understanding.
That's a lovely answer, Dr. Iwanda. Dr. Luke, you also have questions from participants in the Q&A. You have a question asking whether, you know, which stakeholders in Singapore have the most important role in pushing the case for Singlish? And if there is Singlish literature, how do you think that would affect the linguistic, you know, chutzpah of Singaporeans?
Right. Actually, I was just typing some of the responses in, right? So I think the teachers themselves, or even ourselves, have played the most significant role in influencing our students' views towards, you know, standard English and Singlish, right? So even as I've mentioned how the state is extremely powerful here, and of course, they are the ones who implement the syllabus. There is still some wriggle room for teachers in crafting their own sort of responses, enacting their own responses to how they view English in the classroom and how they would want to utilize it as a kind of resource. So even as there's no sort of official endorsement, I think teachers still have room, and there's still space for teachers to actually circumvent, you know, and play around with the rules within the classroom, so to speak. It's not as if, you know, somebody from the Ministry of Education hovers around them 24 hours a day, right? So that's one thing. I mean, speaking from personal experience, so I myself, I was this bright-eyed, naive, beginning teacher that many years ago, you know, a linguistic student going to the classroom thinking, let me, you know, speak Singlish to my students, right, and to build rapport, right, to affirm their sort of localized identities. But of course, then there are certain constraints, right? So when the head of department saw what I was doing, I was immediately told off, right? So the refrain at that time was, you know, the teacher must always model the standard at all times. But of course, teacher attitudes have also changed over the years, and increasingly, especially the younger teachers, they are the ones who are more willing to, you know, try things out and see English as a viable sort of resource in the classroom. So I do see attitudes changing even amongst teachers, especially the younger ones. So hopefully things would move in that direction as we go. As for this question on Singapore literature, I think we do increasingly see an opportunity to push, especially poetry. We haven't had a novel written entirely in English yet, I don't think, but we do have poetry written in English, some of which are studied in, you know, local universities, not yet included in secondary school syllabus, I think. But there is this opportunity, right? So students being able to you know, see artistic forms represented through a vernacular language that they're familiar with. And certainly I think it would help build their confidence of regarding the value of English that they see in their lives. It's not just something which, you know, they use in informal situations. It can actually be used to express you know, certain forms of cultural life that the standard English cannot reach, you know, and will never be able to reach and express, right? So I do think that this is much needed, you know, to allow students to actually study forms of literature that does use English, does, you know, portray the vernacular. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Luke. Would you, I think we have one more minute, and Dr. Yewande a little bit dipped into the issue of nativism. And both of you actually talked about teachers being cognizant and aware of providing a little bit of a space in which different forms of English register or vernacular to be permitted in the classroom. Do you think teachers also need to be of the same ethnicity of students in order to provide that?
No, I don't think so. What's interesting is that for our workshops, as researchers, we were of two different ethnicities and two different cultures. As I said, one was a native speaker of a European language. Right. So no.
Right. Dr. Luke.
So what's the question again?
So I was asking whether, let's say, for example, for a teacher to appreciate Singlish and provide opportunities or spaces in the classroom for that kind of, variety of English to be used, does the teacher also need to be, for example, Singaporean or understand Singlish to provide such safe spaces for students?
I wouldn't preclude non-Singaporeans from being able to do that, but certainly, I would presume that some kind of proficiency and understanding of Singlish would have to be required, right? So same thing for Jamaican Creole, I suppose. Otherwise, it would be difficult to explain some of the cultural understandings or connotations, particularly if you were to engage in activities, for example, if you do contrastive analysis or if you do translation activities, which is often the case for bidialectal forms of pedagogy, then surely you would need proficiency in both, right? So although, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't preclude, a non-Singaporean from doing it, but certainly, you need to be proficient in both registers.
Right. And have
exactly.
An
I think you said it so much more eloquently, Dr. Liu. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Yewande and Dr. Luke. Oh my goodness, time is up. How did that happen? I had a list of questions to ask our speakers today. Najla, would you like to take it from here? Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Luke and Dr. Yewande, for your insightful talks, and Dr. Muna for your wonderful moderation. Thank you for listening, everyone. This has been indeed very enriching. And may I ask you before you leave to please fill out the feedback form for today's session. It's shared earlier by my colleague Fajr in the chat box. And before we end, I would like to say a special thank you and a note of appreciation for our wonderful speakers today. And with that, we conclude our third part of the symposium. Our fourth and final part of the symposium will be held on November 10th, 2022, on Thursday. The registration link can be found in the chat box as well. We look forward to see you all then. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much, Najla. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu and Dr. Yewande, for your lovely, lovely presentations. Thank you, everybody.